So you started to make some progress in Nikke. You're advancing in the story and other modes. You're getting some new units left and right, you know how to invest in your roster of units, and you know the basic essentials for a new player to succeed. But now that the new player grace period is starting to wear off, you're finding that difficulty is starting to ramp up. You're having fun playing with shiny new SSRs you got from the gacha. You know that your team does damage, but you don't yet know exactly how or why. You don't know the intricate synergies, the interactions between buffs, and how burst rotations work. Don't worry, in this video that's part of my detailed series of guides that I call Cummander Bootcamp, I'm going to be explaining in a way that's easy to understand the basic to intermediate concepts of team building and all the information you will need to go off and understand how units in your roster work and how to synergize them with teammates. My name is Psyche, and let's begin with the video. So to start off, I'm going to be splitting the guides on gameplay to two parts. This video is about learning the mechanics of the game and learning how team building works, and in the next tutorial, I'll go over the actual execution of playing a certain team in battle and the difference between auto and manual play. For now, I'll recap the stuff I taught in my absolute beginner's guide on team building, so you have a grasp of what knowledge you're expected to know before this video. There are three types of units in the game: burst 1, 2, or 3. We learned that you need a minimum of one of each in a team in order to enter full burst and get a huge surge of damage boost. We know that element affinities, weapon types, and classes do exist, but not too much beyond that. So that's a good starting point to jump off from. We'll start by learning about burst rotations. Every time you enter the burst gauge, enter full burst, the state will last 10 seconds. Then the burst gauge will be emptied and you'll have to refill it again. Each time this cycle happens, it is known as a burst rotation. It's generally a good idea to optimize your DPS by triggering full burst as many times as possible. If we chart it out, by default, burst state lasts 10 seconds, and then we wait another 10 seconds for your unit's cooldowns to finish, then full burst again. But sometimes that may not be so simple. If you take a look at the cooldown times for each of your unit's burst skill, you can see that it will usually say 20 seconds, but that's not always the case. For all type 3s, their cooldown is at 40 seconds, some type 1s have 40 seconds as well, and Rapunzel being the odd one out at a whopping 60-second cooldown. What does this mean? Well, in a nutshell, since full burst lasts for 10 seconds, this means that as long as you fill the burst gauge again during another 10 seconds, you'll be able to use the burst skill of a unit with a 20-second cooldown again, meaning one unit of a certain type is enough to sustain constant burst rotations. But what if a unit has a cooldown longer than 20 seconds? In that case, it's strongly advised that you want another unit of that type in the team so that their burst skills can be alternated to sustain rotations instead. As far as I know, all type 3s in the game have 40-second cooldowns, meaning ideally you will want at least 2 type 3s in every team. So in the first rotation, one type 3 bursts, and in the second, since the first unit's burst is still in cooldown, you would use your second type 3 unit's burst instead, and you would alternate between the two. Because of how cooldowns work, we can assume that every burst rotation by default is 20 seconds each. I do need to state that type 3s are not the only units in the game with long cooldowns. Let's take a look at Noise, one of the best taunters and healers in the game. She is a type 1 unit with a 40-second cooldown, meaning if you run Noise in the team, you should also run another type 1 unit, as bursting with Noise means that on the second rotation, her cooldown is still not complete, so another type 1 must burst instead in order to enter full burst again. Again, you'll want to make sure you're full bursting as frequently as possible, as that's when your team's damage peaks. So that's basically burst rotations explained and why it's important to optimize your comps to full burst as many times as you can. Now let's go over buffs. It's not a gacha game unless the best units in said game are broken support units. This is no different in Nikke. While some DPS units are exceptional, supports generally can be used with anyone. Under normal circumstances, most type 1 and 2s are supports, and type 3s are the heavy hitters that are expected to do the most damage. That makes a lot of sense if you think about it, since you need to use the burst skill of a type 1 and 2 before getting the 3, you would apply any buffs to your team first, and then you do the damage. There are many ways you can buff your team in the game. There's elemental damage, charge damage, crit damage, core damage. There's an entire calculation on how damage is dealt. Even I don't know the intricate details, but what is important for you to know is that the best buffs in the game by far are attack percentage bonuses and enemy damage taken debuffs. The reason for this is that while attack percentage stacks multiplicatively with your unit's base attack, crit damage is additive instead. Because of this design choice, the average DPS benefits way more from attack buffs versus other types. Any enemy damage taken debuffs are especially good for boss fights too, since the majority of the late game is bosses. Characters like Novel are considered quite strong as they provide this rare type of support. While I do find the choice to not make crit damage scale multiplicatively, unlike in some other gacha games, a little odd, there are cases where other types of buffs that's not attack can be useful. And we're actually just starting to see that. For example, in the Nier collab, we got 2B as a unit in the game, and because she converts max HP to attack, any more attack bonuses becomes less good as the stat is already getting bloated. In that case, buffers of other stats like HP, crit damage, or elemental damage are better. I can't see how the system can get expanded in the future, but for now, stick to these two types of buffs. While we're at it, let's go through the other types of buffs too. Elemental damage refers to the bonus you get from hitting an enemy with a certain element. It's highly situational, but this mechanic can be expanded in the future. Charge damage refers to units that can charge up their attack, namely snipers and rocket launchers. But there are some exceptions, like Maxwell's burst skill that fires a high damaging laser that needs to be charged up. I do need to state that from what I've gathered, charge attack specifically boosts the damage you deal on a full charge. It does not scale proportional to the amount of the gauge you've charged. It only applies to attacks with this small gauge to the side, meaning minigun users do not benefit from charge damage at all, for example. There are a few other types of damage, like damage to parts and core damage, or weapon multipliers, but I'll save those for a future video. One last type of buff, if you can technically call it, is called cooldown reduction and is one of the most powerful support options in the game. Units that have these are generally considered top tier. Cooldown reduction refers to reducing the cooldown of every unit's burst skill, meaning you get to enter full burst more frequently. Remember what I said about wanting to do that, as full burst is when your team's DPS peaks? Well, with cooldown reduction, you essentially get to reduce the amount of downtime in between each burst rotation so that you can use your team at full power more frequently. Let's take a look at this in action. In this comp centering around A2, I'm running Pepper plus Dala as types 1 and 2. Dala will decrease the cooldown of everyone's burst skills every time you enter full burst, and it stacks up to 3 times. Notice that after my first burst rotation, because of the high amount of burst generation, I fill up the gauge really quickly. But notice that Pepper's cooldown is still not finished, meaning I have a couple seconds of downtime where I have to wait to get to full burst again. However, once I reach all 3 stacks of Dala's CDR, you can see that I don't have to wait anymore, since with all 3 stacks combined, she is reducing everyone's burst cooldowns by a solid 5 to 6 seconds. Another example of CDR is Dorothy, who does the buff whenever she empties a magazine. The most premier all-around supporter in this department is Leader, whom a lot of players believe as the best support unit in the game. Let's take a look how good she is based on the stuff we've learned. She reduces cooldown, a bit more than Dala, might I add, repairs cover, which is quite a rare skill by the way, boosts attack by a huge amount with her burst skill, and has a 20-second cooldown, meaning you just need Leader as the only type 1 unit in the team. She's basically the full package for almost any team to thrive. Let's try comparing this to Volume, for example. Even though she's one of the few CDR units in the game, she buffs the team in crit rate and crit damage instead, which, going by what we know about how damage is calculated in Nikke, is way less powerful than Leader on average. Now that we have a good understanding of how team building and the various buffs work, what are the types of content that we will be facing? After all, not all levels are about clearing enemy hordes. While this may seem like the case for the majority of campaign levels, late game content is really focused around bosses. If you look at the tier lists on Pridwin or Nikke.gg, some units are really good for bosses but not so much for campaign. The support characters get to take a break here, since how fast you can clear the different level types will primarily depend on how well your DPS adapts, usually type 3s. For example, Maldernia is really good for endurance or campaign levels, as she gets insane AoE as well as getting infinite ammo upon burst, but at the cost of lowering her normal attack, meaning you don't actually want to use her burst in a boss fight with little destroyable parts. Meanwhile, Alice is a sniper user that gets to spam out attacks like the Flash. While this is really useful for bosses, it's a little wonky when there are many enemies present. This is really something you kinda have to test out for yourself. It won't be for a while before the game throws an actually challenging boss at you in the campaign, but there are moments in the game where it's such a big difficulty spike that some players may get caught off guard. My advice is that thanks to the synchro device, don't be too afraid to switch out units and test them out. Since you don't have to focus on this too much just yet, feel free to take advantage of the grace period while it still lasts. Okay, so that covers the essential mechanics of basic team building. There are still some topics that we haven't covered, like weapon types, manual versus autoplay, but those will be covered in the next volume of my series of guides. Let's recap what we've learned today. It's best to trigger full bursts as many times and as frequently as possible. Attack percent and enemy damage taken are the two most powerful buffs in the game. Cooldown reduction and its impact on burst rotations, as well as the types of levels that you will be facing. All in all, I hope you have a wonderful time figuring out how the game works and finding out what works for you. As always, thank you for watching, and always remember, have fun with the game.